Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I'm delighted to welcome you today and to moderate this fascinating debate between two legendary economists, Professor Robert Gordon from Northwestern University and Professor Philippe Aghion from the Collège de France. So, first of all, let me briefly introduce the topic. So I'm looking for my slides. Yeah. So let's start with Robert Solow's legendary statement from 1987. So you can see it written there. You can see the computer age everywhere except in the productivity statistics. So it illustrates the idea that the spread of information and communication technologies, so ICTs, in the US economy do not seem to have translated into significant productivity gains. And the idea has been revived notably since the 2008 crisis with the observation of a stalling labor productivity in US and in Europe. You can think of France or of Germany. So this revives the idea of secular stagnation, that is to say, a long-term situation of negligible growth. And that's our topic today, secular stagnation. So I wanted to do, maybe a short poll among you. According to you in the audience, are we doomed to secular stagnation? So please, those who think that we are doomed to secular stagnation, raise your hands. And thank you. And those who think that we are not doomed to secular stagnation? Okay, so it's rather split. We'll see at the end.
A lot of people didn't vote.
Yeah, that's true. But we'll see that if your mind changes after the conference. So many questions arise. Are we doomed to secular stagnation? Can the revolution of AI change the game? Have ideas really become harder to get? And what about the ecological issue, the demographic issue? Can public policy reverse the trend? So we will proceed in the following way. I will start by asking our two debaters to present rapidly their views on secular stagnation. Then I will ask them a few questions, and then we'll open the floor to questions. So don't hesitate. If you have questions, you have a phone number here where you can ask your questions online. So let me introduce you to our two speakers. So first, we are glad to welcome Robert Gordon, who is professor at Northwestern University in Chicago. So Robert Gordon, you are rather techno-pessimistic. You argue that the one big wave of productivity that occurred in the 20th century was an isolated incident in the history of humanity. According to you, there are several headwinds that stand in the way of ever-sustained growth, like demographic trends, growing inequality, climate change payback, or debt overhang. And in your book, The Rise and Fall of American Growth, you use the parable of the fruit tree, arguing that the low-hanging fruit of technological breakthroughs have already been picked, and that the picking will, in the future, become increasingly difficult. So the floor is yours for 12 minutes. Thank you.
What is secular stagnation? It means that productivity growth is slow, but slow compared to what? As you'll see in a minute, you get a totally different answer if you look at the United States versus Europe. But I can give you a simple answer if I choose the dates right. If I choose the dates between 1890 and now, and divide in 1914 at the beginning of World War I, and 1972, which is the end of the big post-war productivity revival of the United States, you see that between 1914 and 72, output per hour in the United States and Europe grew at exactly the same rate, almost 3% a year for 58 years. If we look at the years since 1972, for the US, it's fallen by almost half. For Europe, it's fallen by a little less than half. And by E17, I mean the 17 nations of Western Europe that were not part of the communist bloc before 1990. So this suggests that the slowdown fundamentals are the same across the Atlantic. But the timing is totally different in the US and Europe. Here is a vivid way of saying what is secular stagnation. This is the growth rate of productivity output per hour in those 3 periods before 1914, middle of 58 years, and since 1972. Red, of course, is the US, blue is Europe, the E17. And there you see doubling after 1914, falling by almost half after 1972. And if you take total factor productivity, which subtracts out the growth in capital and labor quality, you see the even more dramatic decline. For the US, it's declined from 1.8 to 0.6, falling by 2/3. And for Europe, it's fallen from 2.1 to 1, fallen by about a half. So this is secular stagnation. What happened before 1972 and after 1972? Well, you know my answer. My answer is the great inventions. Between 1870 and 1900, we had the invention of electricity, the transition from candles to electric light, the invention of the internal combustion engine, the replacement of the horse by the motor. We had chemistry, we had pharmaceuticals, we had entertainment and communication with the telephone, with movies, with photography, with radio, with television. And we had what I think is the most important in terms of consumer surplus, and that is running water, urban sanitation infrastructure. The water came into the bathroom, newly invented, and it was flushed out underground. And that made possible a huge improvement in general mortality and specifically in infant mortality. Now, where does the post-1995 IT, information technology, or digital revolution fit in? Well, we had, of course, personal computers, office and personal software. We had web browsers, broadband, search engines, and e-commerce. So there was just a huge transition from typewriters and file cabinets to everything digital. But despite that, US productivity only regained that 58-year average for 10 years instead of 58 years. That just tells me that the IT revolution was less important than all those great inventions put away, because they boosted productivity for almost 60 years. And this is true in both Europe and the US. And I'm going to suggest later that just as computers were less important than electricity, because of course you couldn't have computers without electricity, so large language models and artificial intelligence are less important than the computer revolution, because you've got to have computers to do artificial intelligence. You look at the two sides of the Atlantic, however, since 1950, it's totally different. Here in brown, orange, you see the history for the United States, now taking only 1972, but also vertical lines in 1995, 2005, and 2019. And there you see healthy productivity growth after the war, after 1972, what we all puzzled about, the great slowdown, revival after 1995. We all said, IT revolution, there it is, but it went away after 2005. Interestingly, we've come back a bit since 2019, very different than Europe. Look at Europe, how different it is. Rapid growth in the Les 30 Glorieuses, as they're often called, the 25 or 30 years after the war, as Europe caught up for wartime destruction and being less productive in the interwar years. Then we had a reduction by half in the 72 to 95 period, another reduction, another reduction, another reduction. So Europe, these 17 countries, have had productivity growth of only 0.2 in the last 5 years. Put them together, you see just a totally different history. You see Europe way ahead in the first two periods and increasingly behind in the last 3 periods. Now, what about the level? Obviously, if Europe is growing faster, the level catches up to the US. If it's growing slower, the level of productivity falls back behind the US. Same dividing years. You see that Europe, because it was growing faster, reaches a peak level of productivity relative to the US. Horizontal line at 100%. So believe it or not, Europe had higher productivity in all 17 countries taken together from 1980 to 2005, and then has gradually fallen behind, and is now down to around 86%. It might surprise you that it's as high as 110%. I mean, this includes Greece, it includes Portugal, it includes Spain, Italy. And indeed, there are two different data sets, as I'm going to mention in my talk tonight, and they differ. One of them actually says Europe was 120%, and the other says it was 100%. So the average of the two data sets says 110%. Now, why have we had a slowdown after 2005 on both sides of the Atlantic? A famous idea, which I hinted at in my book, but was documented by 4 famous Stanford economists, is that new ideas are getting harder to find. And they documented this for such things as Moore's Law, the idea that the number of transistors on a computer chip doubles every 2 years. They showed that takes 15 times more research workers to achieve that steady rate of growth. They've shown there's a radical reduction in the number of new drugs relative to the people doing research on new drugs. And an idea that Philippe has analyzed extensively is the idea that incumbent firms stifle innovation by preventing the entry of young, new, dynamic firms, and that something that I've emphasized, that firms are spending less on innovation now and more on dividends and especially share buybacks, especially in the United States. So here are some examples of this diminishing returns to innovation. I mentioned Moore's Law already. There's a phenomenon that is related to computer chips, that it just becomes more and more and more expensive to make that last little infinitesimal shrinkage in the computer chips. TSMC, the famous Taiwan semiconductor company, is spending almost $20 billion to build one factory in the United States to do computer chips. And they're reaching the end of the possibilities on computer chips and squeezing more transistors into the chips. It's like trying to paint a 1-inch line with a 2-inch paintbrush. Here's a chart from the Economist from last May showing an 80-to-1 decline in the number of lives saved per investment, inflation-adjusted investment in research. 80 times reduction. So that's not all that is in my book about faltering innovation. What is, I think, particularly important moving forward, because we obviously have innovation going on all over the place, are these 6 headwinds. And I'll just reel off the 6 ones in my book and then focus on 3 of them. So, rising income inequality. That means that median income grows slower than average or mean income. The second one is education. A major source of economic growth in the 20th century was the increase in educational attainment. First, more people completing high school, then more people completing college. That's over. It's certainly over in the United States. Demography, the aging population, declining fertility, and the smaller number of workers paying taxes to support the pensions and the medical care of the older people. Fiscal deficits and debt, of course, heavily linked to the aging population. Globalization, which tends to shift real income to the emerging countries and shift it away from middle-class workers in factories in the advanced countries that are forced to close. And finally, climate change, which you know all about. So let me just focus on 3 of these. Education, the linkage between demography and the fiscal debt, and finally, climate change. So Claudia Goldin and Larry Katz, 2 famous Harvard economists, wrote a book claiming that the increase in educational attainment added 0.4% per year to U.S. productivity growth through most of the 20th century. Yet, if you look at the percent of Americans who have BA or higher degrees, that percent has stalled at 39% for those born in 1968, to 38%, 39% for those born 30 years later. And so what do we have? We have a declining demand for higher education because of rising costs, rising student debt, and we also have a phenomenon that's probably true in much of Europe, it's certainly true in the United States, that fully half of American college 4-year graduates cannot find a job that requires a college education, and those are the Starbucks baristas. So what about demography and fiscal policy? Declining birth rates mean fewer workers to support more retirees. The U.S. debt to GDP ratio is forecast to increase from 2.4 to 3.9% over the next 15 or 10 years, and that doesn't even include the likely increase in long-term interest rates. We have two partial solutions that I'll mention when we come to solutions, and that is index the retirement age to life expectancy, which of course is a forbidden topic in France, and much more legal immigration tied to skills. We've got in the United States two great examples of immigration. We have the founder of Apple, Steve Jobs, was a son of a Syrian immigrant. And the founder of Google, the co-founder of Google, Sergey Brin, was a Russian immigrant. More skilled people coming in have got to help improve productivity growth. So without it, we get a crowding out of private investment, of government R&D and infrastructure. And don't get me started on climate change. My graduate school office mate, William Nordhaus, Nobel Prize winner, has said that in the year 2100, warming of 3 degrees Celsius would only reduce the level of GDP by 3% and reduce the growth rate of GDP by 0.04%. Very controversial. A lot of people disagree with him. Triple, quadruple his estimate. It's still trivial for the future rate of growth. And just think of all the different ways in which green technology and the green revolution crowds out productive investment for innovation. We have the replacement of fossil fuel generation by the investment in solar and wind. We have the replacement of internal combustion engine auto factories by electric vehicle factories. We hear a lot about Volkswagen and its troubles every day. We have the replacement of heating by electric heat pumps. Perfectly decent furnaces in all the homes are going to have to be torn out and replaced with massive investment. And we have the electric generating capacity itself. We have to build a lot more electric generating capacity to get batteries for the temporary renewable energy and for electric heating. Just a couple of additional features. I am very skeptical of explanations of falling productivity growth that depend on some generalization that applies to the whole economy. Because look at what's happened for the last almost 20 years in the United States. 17 industries. I won't tell you what they are, except the top one is information technology. This is the annual productivity growth rate in the United States for the last 18 years. It ranges from 6% positive to, for information technology, to 1.5% negative at the bottom for construction. You just cannot have the same story across all industries. So just one last word before I conclude. One of these industries for the United States is manufacturing, of course, the traditional heart of the economy. Here's what it looks like. The slowdown is even greater in U.S. manufacturing than it is in the total economy in Europe. U.S. manufacturing in the last 15 years has had virtually zero productivity growth. So here are the conclusions. The long-term difference is the way to think about secular stagnation. The reason productivity growth was so rapid for 58 years was the great inventions. In the future, we're going to have a battle between the stimulus to productivity growth coming from AI and the burden of the headwinds, which I've talked about. Since 2005, our ideas have been harder to find. Heterogeneity across industries prevents us from finding convincing any explanation that depends on economy-wide factors. And finally, what's causing this manufacturing stagnation? What are all these robots doing? Thank you. Do you want to pray?
Maybe. So, thank you very much. Before I give the floor to Philippe, I will present him. So thank you very much, Robert Gordon. So Philippe Aghion, I don't know if I shall introduce you, as you are one of the pillars of the Economics Days in Lyon. So you are professor at the Collège de France, INSEAD, and the London School of Economics, and you are more of a techno-optimistic. You argue that productivity growth is poorly measured, casting doubt on the idea of secular stagnation. You defend the idea that the ICT and AI revolutions improve the production of ideas, thus generating growth. In your book, The Power of Creative Destruction, you argue that the recent decline in productivity is largely due to institutions and public policies, notably competition policy, that are ill-adapted to technological revolutions. So the floor is now yours for 12 minutes.
12? Yeah.
Around
Okay.
12 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. All right. So, so first, it's an honor to be with Robert Gordon, who has been a big influence on me. So that's, we are very lucky to have Robert with us today. So I want to play, since it's about the debate, Robert is more on the pessimistic side. I would say that I am on the moderately optimistic, and particularly today, I think we are, you know, I like to go for cognitive dissonance or cautious optimism and try to see if we can see light in the middle of the darkness. So it's true when you look at this curve, I mean, you see, which was produced by my friend Antonin, who is with us today, and Gilles Berset and Mr. Leca. It's true that you see since 1941, if you look at the evolution of TFP growth in the US, you feel that, you know, you see that the electricity combustion engine wave seems to be much higher than the IT wave, which is the second wave that you see, the second summit. You see so that seems to go, you see, to agree with, you know, to confirm a bit what Robert is saying, that, you know, earlier big inventions were more important than later big. But I want to put some elements of optimism, okay? So first I want to argue that ideas may not be so necessarily harder to find, okay? And then I will talk a bit about the AI revolution, okay? And I will say a few things related in addition. Robert mentioned this paper by Bloom et al., Ideas Harder to Find. They are all my except Mr. Webb, the first three are my friends and co-authors, and I'm fond of them. They're fantastic economists, and it was a pleasure to co-author with each of them. Bloom, Jones, and Van Reenen have been doing work with each of them. Different papers, by the way. So I tried just to go back to what Robert alluded to. First, you can look, you know, at the evolution, at the number of researchers is the green curve, and the US TFP growth. And you see that there is an ever-increasing number of researchers in the US, and it's not reflected in, and the TFP growth has remained essentially around 2%, or more or less. You see what I mean? There has not been a corresponding increase in the TFP growth rate in the US, corresponding to the increase in number of researchers. That goes back to work that Chad Jones did in the mid-90s, and from that work, he concluded that the research productivity, which is the ratio of growth over the number of researchers, has gone down. Because if the number of researchers has gone up and the growth has not, is that the efficiency of research presumably went down, and therefore ideas are harder to find. So that was a very macro study. It has been a bit challenged at the time by Peter Howitt and Alwyn Young in papers in 98, 99, who were saying, but maybe what happens that many of the inventions are just copies. You know, we spread out. They don't make growth go up so much. It's just, you know, we have a big idea and we implement the idea in many subfields, and that doesn't make growth go up so much. And so in response to that, they produced this most recent paper where they say, even if you look at particular subfield, like, for example, transistors, you find the idea, it suggests that ideas are harder to find. So here there is the Moore's law. The Moore's law is that the number of transistors on a silicium chip chip, c'est une puce, hein, doubles every 2 years. Okay, that's Moore's law. Okay, and that's what you should achieve. But the thing is that what they argue in their paper is that the number of researchers required to double the number of transistors per chip is 18 times higher today than it was in the 1970s, okay? And they conclude that even if you look at subdomains like transistors, but it's also true for medicines, or it's also true for agriculture, you would find that, you know, the research productivity has gone on. You need more researchers, apparently, to achieve the same outcome in terms of TFP growth as you would have before, okay? So that's a bit the case for ideas harder to find, okay? And now my questions, that's where I have some questions at least, you see. First, you know, computing power has increased not just by increasing the number of transistors per chip, but also by rearranging the transistors. So, for example, AI revolution, it's a lot about rearranging. It's not just that you need to double the number of transistors, it's that you rearrange them. That's not something they take into account, okay? Something else they don't take into account is that new chips can do more things than older chips. So maybe they can do more. So we should deflate by a measure of product variety. There is the variety of what the chip can do. Maybe you produce better chips now than you could before, okay? That's not taken into account in the analysis, okay? And look, there is the economic profession. The economic profession, when I was a student in France, what was very much on fashion was general equilibrium models, you know, micro, arrow de Breu. And you would prove fixed point theorems, existence, uniqueness, stability of equilibria. So that was very much on fashion. This line of research went up and then went down. But then you had new subdomains of economics. You had incentive theory, you had contract theory, you had game theory, and then you had all new fields. So it's true within each subfield, each line, you end up running into decreasing returns, but you always find new lines. And so my view, and I can't see that the ideas are harder to find in the economic profession. In fact, we have too many good papers. Now, it's not enough to have the American Economic Review. You had to create American economic journals because there were not enough. The Quarterly Journal of Economics, which was quarterly, now it's monthly, because we have so many good papers. I was editor of Restat, Review Economic of Statistics, for 8 years. I had to refuse many very good papers. And so in my own field, in each particular subdomains, ideas end up becoming harder to find. But if you look at economics as a whole, I don't see at all economy, because if you go up, if you take, you know, if you step back sufficiently, you don't find that ideas harder to find. Within each line it is, but you always have new lines. I want also to say something there before I move to the AI revolution. Dentists, for example. I go to a dentist nowadays. It's much less painful than when I used to go to a dentist in the 1960s. They would do painful and endless drilling. Now it's a different thing. Is that counted in GDP? Not obviously, not entirely. Photo pictures. We used to have, to take a picture, you would have the film, you would have to develop the film, and then it would be a whole thing. Now you take your iPhone and you take pictures. Is that counted in GDP? Travel agents, now, we don't need to go to travel agent. We can book our plane tickets in 5 minutes. Before you need to queue, it would take you half a day. Is that fully counted in GDP? And another idea I want to submit to you. We are moving a lot from quantity innovation to quality. That's something I'm currently doing with Fabrizio Zilibotti and other co-authors. We move from quantity to quality. Is that something that's counted in measured GDP growth? Maybe in terms of utils, we are still growing, and that is not maybe fully reflected in TFP growth figures. You see, so I want just to submit that. Let me go to AI revolution. AI, why should I believe that AI boosts productivity growth? Because it automates both tasks in the production of goods and services and tasks in the production of ideas. That's my work, by the way, with Chad Jones and Ben Jones. Why do I believe that AI stimulates the production of ideas? Because AI helps find solutions to complex problems. It facilitates imitation and learning, and it can become self-improving. For example, in very recent work, Eric Brynjolfsson from Stanford and co-authors look at the effect of introducing ChatGPT in the management of a company. So it's a US company in the top 500, in the Fortune 500, and it's a US company that advises small and medium-sized enterprises on how to adopt software. So the employees are in the Philippines. So when you call, you end up with someone in the Philippines, and they look at the effect of introducing ChatGPT as a tool to these Filipinos employees. And they measure productivity by the number of problems that are solved per hour. And what they find, they compare the productivity of a Filipino employee who has access to ChatGPT to a similar employee in terms of prior productivity who doesn't have access. And you see the increase is significant. It increases by 14% after 1 month and 25% after 2 months already. That's big. And many companies, if you ask them, when you introduce AI, and in particular generative AI, which is ChatGPT in particular, does it increase productivity? Yes, it does increase productivity. And so you may want to say, okay, that's one company. How you extrapolate to aggregate growth? One way is to extrapolate from previous GPTs, but that maybe Robert would tell me, well, I would not do that, because how do you know that AI will be as important as electricity or even IT? Another one is to adopt a task-based approach, is to say, well, what are the share of tasks that are subject to AI? Among those that are exposed to AI, among those what is the share of tasks which is profitably, you can profitably introduce AI? What is the share of labor there? And to which extent does AI automate labor, increase the productivity of labor? And that's something that Daron Acemoglu has done in a recent paper, and he found 0.07 extra point of growth for 10 years. With the co-author, with Simon Bunel, we went back to the numbers, and we found that it's 0.7, that in fact the figures, the Acemoglu figures are way too pessimistic. If you redo exactly his analysis, but you put other figures, you get a 0.7 percentage point. What's very interesting is that if I just extrapolate from IT gave you an extra 0.8 percentage point of growth. Means that if I start with 1% of growth, I am 1.8% of growth for 10 years. You see what I mean? And what we find here is that AI is, if you take the task-based approach, you find 0.7 extra. So very much in the same ballpark as if you extrapolate from IT. So it's kind of, and I don't want to go into detail of how we get the 0.7, but it means, in fact, you have a figure like this. Without AI, you would have the dotted line. With AI, that's the evolution of GDP, you have a steeper line for 10 years. The continuous line is steeper than the dotted line, and then after 10 years you go back to the same slope, okay? But on the other hand, this doesn't take into account that AI does not only automate tasks in the production of goods and services, it also automates tasks in the production of ideas. And for example, we know a lot of growth is recombinant growth. You recombine much more easily when you have AI. Okay, I get there. So, so you have something like this, quoi. You see, so the true, without, if you just look at automating goods, production of goods and services, you would have the red line. But in fact, because you also automate the production of ideas, you improve the innovation technology, and therefore you get the light blue line. So more growth in the short run, and even more growth all the time. So technologically, I believe AI will make ideas easier to find and has a big growth potential. The problem now, and that's why I'm moderately optimistic, is that there are institutional obstacles to growth, and particularly the lack of competition. I need from you. Yeah. Yeah, but I just want to finish mine. So, for example, you see in the recent work with Pete Clino, Antonin, Timo Boppard, and Yui Lee, published in the Review of Economic Studies, we show this picture that the average yearly rate of TOP growth went down a lot since the year 2000 in the US, but we saw that it was particularly true in the IT producing sector, the black line, and the IT using sector, the gray line, and it has a lot to do with the fact that with with the IT revolution, you had the emergence of GAFAM, les superstar firms. And they grew by merger and acquisition. And eventually, they discouraged entry of new innovating firms. You see, first they carried the growth process, but then they became tentacular. You can see, if you look at the markup, the average markup in the US is the red curve goes up, but not so much because within firm it goes up. The within firm is the blue line, but it's because of the black line. It's a composition effect. The high markup firms, which were the GAFAM, which were the superstar firms, became more important because they did merger and acquisition without being opposed by an adequate competition policy. So what happened, in fact, in the US is that competition policy did not adapt to the IT revolution and made it possible for these firms to become so big that they would end up discouraging new entry of non-superstar. Here you see the entry rate of firms of all sizes in the US going down since the year 2000, okay? So I just conclude, ideas are not necessarily harder to find, even less with AI. But AI has, I believe, technologically a high growth potential. But the problem is that you have inappropriate institutions, in particular, inappropriate competition policy may hamper the growth process. And why is it a problem with AI? Because the cloud is dominated by 3 superstar firms, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, and you have one big actor, GPU, on the market for graphic processes. So the problem there is that technology goes very fast, but institutions are always too slow to adapt to the technology, and that's why we may run into a secular stagnation. So my view is that technologically we have everything possible, but the break is are the institutions and policies. The institutional change is always too slow to adapt to technological change. Well, thank you very much.
Do you mind if we change the Thank you very much, Philippe. So don't hesitate to raise your questions. You have the number. So before I give before I take all your questions, I wanted to maybe to rebound on a few things you have said, and maybe to ask you both a first question. So when it comes to explaining the declining growth and Solow's paradox, if I come back to my first slide, isn't the main problem the mismeasurement of productivity growth, especially in post-industrial and digital economies? So maybe.
I've heard a lot about the mismeasurement story. Let's distinguish between productivity and consumer surplus. There is no doubt that the invention of the smartphone created a lot of consumer surplus. GPS, listening to music, taking photos, making telephone calls, all on the same device, watching the internet, searching the internet. Is that the only time consumer surplus has diverged from productivity growth? Let's just think, why aren't we getting productivity growth out of smartphones? First of all, they're all made in Asia. So the hardware doesn't help US productivity growth or European productivity growth. Second, the software is all done in the US, all these big firms. That doesn't help productivity growth in Europe at all. So it's not surprising that we're creating consumer surplus by inventing something new that doesn't reflect itself in productivity. But think of all the examples. Let's go back to electricity, which has 100 different uses. The transition from reading at night with a candle to having an electric light. Think of the difference. Think of the difference made by transitioning from a horse, which lays waste all over the streets, to a motor car that can go 10 times as fast as a horse. There's enormous consumer surplus throughout the 20th century created by new inventions that does not show up in productivity. Think of running water. Would you trade your smartphone for having to go out to an outhouse and to carry water a mile from the well or the river into your house for cooking and cleaning and bathing? So it's an old story that we missed the consumer surplus. Is it more now than it was in 1900 or 1910? I don't think it's possible to answer that question except by telling stories.
Thank you very much. Philippe, maybe you want to react on the mismeasurement of growth?
No, I fully agree. I fully agree with what, but that's what's interesting is to say, if we are after growth of utils, of growth of well, how do we capture, how measured per capita GDP growth captures this growth in utils, so and that's I think is I think that's part of the so that would be, so I completely concur with what Robert answered.
Yeah, so you were both talking about developing, well, about developed countries. Maybe, do you have a hint at the difference between maybe developing and developed countries? Is secular stagnation just for developed countries?
Well, here we just had a Nobel Prize for Daron Acemoglu and his co-authors, tracing the problems of developing countries back to the colonial era and the difference between those places that were pleasant to live, like Australia and the United States and Canada, which developed democratic, well-ordered institutions, and places like Africa and Latin America, where the Europeans didn't so much enjoy the life because of tropical diseases, and they extracted resources and led to dictators and unstable governments. I think his story is a little bit too simple because a lot of Europeans live in, ex-Europeans live in Latin America, so I don't think this bifocal, bimodal characterization of developed versus rich countries is totally accurate. I think you have special problems in sub-Saharan Africa that go way beyond the Acemoglu story. But let me just make that one my thought on that. I'm sure Philippe has thought about it.
Yeah, the question was the idea that is secular stagnation only for developed countries? I mean, what happens in developing countries?
In joint work I did with Daron and Fabrizio Zilibotti, so this is very incestuous, we had the view that when you can grow, you know, we did not invent that idea, we tried to formalize it, but you can grow either by imitating the frontier technology or by innovating at the frontier. And so, for example, China grew very fast because it was catching up growth, and they could catch up because they had education, and when they joined the WTO, they could absorb, they had foreign direct investment, and they absorbed technology coming from more developed countries, from the US in particular, given that they had a high education level, they had a high absorptive capacity, as Cohen-Levinthal would say, and they were able to grow fast. So the secret of Chinese growth is really the combination between education and FDI, and they could absorb technology. Europe, after World War II, we grew by catching up as well. We rebuilt our capital stock, that's something Antonin Bergeau, who is here, explains very well, and we also had a technological catch-up thanks to the education system that we had in Europe. And but again, we were catching up with the US. And then it becomes another problem, is that the very nice picture that Robert showed, that at some moment Europe stops catching up, and in fact the gap, the technological gap between US and Europe starts growing again when you have the IT revolution, because Europe doesn't manage to, to absorb this revolution as well as it could for various reasons, which motivate the Draghi report. But there is the catching up growth and the frontier growth. And I think those are, when you are at the frontier, you need to have new ideas. When you are catching up, you need mainly to absorb ideas from elsewhere. And the institutions that are good for catching up are not necessarily the same institutions that are good for frontier innovation. And that's what I want to, and the problem we are dealing with the secular stagnation, I think I see it as mainly, why is at frontier innovation, is it becoming harder? Not so much about catching up growth, but that's my own response.
Thank you. Do you want to add something? Or?
No, I just thought that I could add that not all developing countries are the same, and we have this absolutely amazing catch-up in not only China, but of course we had this tremendous catching up in South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore. So there's something very special about linking together the institutions, particularly the emphasis on education, with the technology that you're copying from the leader. A lot has been written about India versus China. And if you don't think that institutions are important, just start studying why India had a higher standard of living than China up to 1995, and why it now has a standard of living 1/3 as high. It just did not have the combination of private and public institutions that China did. Whatever you think of authoritarian governments versus democracy, those are enough to convince you that institutions matter. Not just the Acemoglu bimodal thing, but much more within the developed world.
Exactly. Thank you. So maybe another question. You have already much answered to this question. So on the idea that have ideas become harder to have, and is there a decline in R&D efficiency? Maybe you want to add something on this, or?
I think that it's very possible that we have a continuation of creation of ideas. We know that the growth of patents per year, you know what patents are, the licensing of new technology has exploded in the last 20 years. We have more patents being created that goes along with having more research workers. The question is, what is the payoff? And I think both Philippe and I agree that there is a crucial distinction to be made between payoff in productivity and payoff in consumer surplus, so that it could be that a lot of these new ideas are creating a lot of consumer surplus, but they're not actually increasing the measured output that is produced by a set of inputs.
You want to
No, that's
okay. Maybe well, you already talked much about artificial intelligence revolution. I mean, it's still ahead of us, so it's quite difficult to have a precise idea on this issue. But do you see it, I mean, as something which will be short-lived, as something which is a bit overhyped, or do you think it will spark a real new wave?
Okay, I have a lot to say because Philippe has written down what he thinks about this. And you haven't heard from me yet. First of all, artificial intelligence is not new. It's at least 15 years old. When we talk about Eric Brynjolfsson's study of consumer surplus, of the productivity of customer service representative, this is the last stage of the transition of customer service phone calls from voice of humans to voice of computers that understand voice recognition so that the computer can talk to you. If you go back 15 years ago, most of who you talked to on customer service calls were people. And then gradually, more and more of your conversation with the customer service agent is taken over by a computer, and more, instead of keying in the number, you just speak the number because they understand you. So we're well on the way of the transition in that particular field of work from no AI to almost complete use of AI. The same goes with language translation. I mean, I feel sorry for people who built their career translating languages because they're now pretty much obsolete. Legal searches, radiology diagnosis in medicine, AI has been working on those for at least 10 years. So these large language models are indeed a transition to a new and productive type of AI. But remember that all these previous uses of AI that I just mentioned haven't budged the secular stagnation in the productivity statistics. On the future, I think it's very important to divide up the economy. I showed you 17 industries and how different their productivity growth is. I like to divide them into three groups. Goods, which are utilities, mining, construction, and manufacturing. Contact services, where the very essence of the job is to be in contact with another human, and that is wholesale, retail, transportation, accommodation, food services, nurses in hospitals, teachers in elementary school, face-to-face with their customers. And then finally, the third group are people who work most of their life looking in a computer screen, and all of those industries are capable of working from home. I call them the WFH, working from home industries. And if you look at the percent of US employment in working from home computer-based industries, it's only 23%. And by coincidence, Darnos Acemoglu's percent of tasks is 21%. So if you start out and you say, well, what are the percent of tasks that are likely to be impacted by AI? It's somewhere less than a quarter, somewhere around a quarter, not 60%, which is the Philippe number. And then you have the question of, well, how much of the tasks are actually going to be affected by AI? And here I'd like to report on a very interesting recent study by 2 economists at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania who are experts on the nature of work. And they have done time and motion studies on computer programmers. And most people say the biggest payoff from AI is going to be writing computer code. Well, they pointed out that if you take people who are computer programmers, only 1/3 of their day is spent actually writing code. The rest of it is figuring out what the project is, communicating with the people using the project, administrative work, all sorts of other things. And if we talk about AI replacing jobs, you can't just cut off 1/3 of a job, because the other 2/3 of what they do gives them the expertise to write the computer software in the first place. So there's just a couple of examples of why I think Philippe's moderate optimism about AI uses numbers that are a little bit too high. I think Acemoglu may be too low. Probably the truth is somewhere in between, but we're not going to know what the truth is for at least 10 more years.
Yeah. No, so absolutely we have to. There is a range, and what we believe. But my source of optimism on AI and growth technologically is the fact that, and that's what we are currently with Antonin so we are looking into the fact that, you know, the automation of ideas. So far there's been studies looking at automating tasks in the production of goods and services. And we would like to be able to do the same for idea production, to be able to see, maybe on some particular cases, how much AI improves the technology of the researcher. You see what I mean? To find an idea, to recombine an idea, how much time do I save by having ChatGPT, generative AI at my disposal? And that's what you see, and that's what I think makes AI different from previous technological revolution, is that it will, I think, improve our innovation technology. The whole question is by how much, and that, I think, is all to be done. There is no, so far, not that I know, empirical study looking at the productivity growth that you can get from AI just by the fact that it automates the production of ideas, that it helps you recombine more quickly, that it helps you, that it's a fantastic research tool that saves enormous amount of time. Maybe you can write more papers in the same amount of, within the same time frame with AI than without AI. Well, those are the kind of things, for the moment, we don't have any empirical evidence on that. But my hinge is that there is enormous technological potential of AI. My main worry on AI is really the institutional worry, is mainly the fact that, you know, the institutions, and in particular competition policy, may get in the way. That's why in a recent report that I produced for President Macron, that we handed over to Macron in March, I insisted the importance of open source, to have the Digital Market Act extended to the whole value chain of AI, to have a competition policy like Richard Gilbert of Berkeley advocates, which is much more whenever you decide to allow or not to allow a new merger and acquisition, you look not only at market share and market definition, but you look at the effect that the merger could have on subsequent entry and subsequent innovation. We need to reform competition policy much more. And also in Europe, we need to not prevent industrial policy in the name of competition policy. Very much in Europe, taking pretext of competition policy, we've ruled out any form of industrial policy. I think we need to have both competition policy and industrial policy to push, you know, computer power, to push diffusion of AI in the overall economic system. And that, I think, those are topics that very much we push in this report. And but reforming competition policy is very important, and in policies and institutions. I think that's very much my fear is from, I mean, when you see the outcome of the American election, I don't know what will come out of it. When we see, you know, the political instability in France, my worry is very much more on that side than on the technological side. I think that's where the technology is there, but the politicians don't get their acts together. Starting with several of our ministers or ex-ministers don't know anything in economics. They haven't learned economics. You don't learn economics at École normale d'administration, for example. I mean, that's a big topic, but I mean, that's much more of a worry for me than the technology.
Thank you. Maybe if I just can add to what Robert Gordon said on the idea, this idea that you have some jobs which will be replaced, others that won't be replaced. this will be, a parenthesis, this will be the topic of the next conference after this conference, Artificial Intelligence and Employment. So if you're interested, don't hesitate to join us. But maybe just to add, for instance, that's in a paper from the International Labour Organization by several authors like Gmirek and Berg and co-authors, there is this idea that you have augmentation of some of some tasks and augmentation of some jobs, and you have also replacement. But what they show is that you have more labors that are augmented than that are replaced, than jobs that are replaced. It goes a bit in the same sense that what you said about the, the 1/3 and 2/3 of jobs. So I had, you have partly answered, but I had a question about the policy, which is, as we saw, quite important, an important question. So do you think that there are policy tools that can counteract the forces of secular stagnation? And if not, do you think there would be a possible political agenda, and what would it look like in a world where secular stagnation is accepted? So.
Let me make two comments. One is, I heard the word election, and so if you do not know it, Mr. Trump made his victory speech at 8:30 this morning, and the polls were totally wrong again. He's going to win the popular vote by 3 to 4%, even though the polls all said that it was even. So we have a very turbulent 4 years ahead of us in the United States, and of course in Europe and the Ukraine and a lot of other places. The consequences are very important. Another very personal comment is that you may have noticed I just took a photo of Philippe with all the consumer surplus that I get out of this phone. And if you will look at my website, just Google my Robert J. Gordon name, you will find on my website a photo gallery of 400 pictures of economists going back to 1967. And so you can see every famous economist, what they looked like as young men and middle-aged people, and even as they got older. So I am going to self-advertise that photo gallery on my website. What about policy? I think the policies are different in Europe and the US. I think for both sides of the Atlantic, think about these future deficits and these high interest rates and how they're going to crowd out investment. And you've got to raise the retirement age, and you've got to allow more skilled immigration to get more young people in to fight the aging of the population. That's for the US. I disagree with Philippe on competition policy. I think the real thing that changed after 1995 were network effects. Information technology has high fixed costs and low marginal costs. That gives a tremendous advantage to becoming bigger. We all benefit by the fact that there is one Google and not 100 different search engines. Because all the searching goes through Google, it gets better and better and better. And it's just about to get even better as it adds AI. And you'll be able to put in a search term and get a whole essay on a topic. The same is, of course, true of Facebook and true of Microsoft, with us all using the same software. So on competition policy, I disagree. On Europe, I think the issue is the companies are too small. The EU budget is too small. We need to have a shift of resources from 27 national governments to a central EU budget so they can do things like having a CHIPS Act and subsidize new AI development, new semiconductor manufacture. There are a lot of other problems with Europe, which we have a whole session at 6 p.m. tonight where I'm going to start off and talk about Europe versus the US. It goes both ways. There are a lot of good things about Europe, and boy, did I enjoy them at dinner last night in Lyon.
Yeah, on policy, so for the US, I mean, I think I think there are things that can be done. For example, one thing that can be also improved in the US, everywhere in France as well, the education system. So, for example, Xavier Jaravel has done very interesting work showing, with Raj Chetty, and I did some work myself with Ufuk Aksigit and co-authors in Finland. We have what we call lost Einsteins. We have a lot in our countries of very smart kids. And because they don't have access to education, they fail to become innovators. And parents try to make up. So when you come from privileged family or knowledgeable parents, they can transmit, knowledge and aspirations to the children. But when you come from a poor background with uneducated parents and you go to bad schools, you have some very intelligent young boys and girls who could have become inventors and don't become inventors. I mean, so we have enormous waste of intelligence in our developed countries. A lot of what we call lost, they call them lost Einsteins. We have a lot of lost. So I think that's a huge margin whereby we could improve our rate of innovation. And what's very nice with it is that you would make the economy both more innovative and more inclusive. So education is something that makes you more innovative, more inclusive. Competition policy, which I believe is important, makes you more innovative because you have competition fosters innovation. That's work I've done myself with Howitt and others, and Blondel. But it also makes the economy more inclusive because entrant innovation generates creative destruction, and creative destruction is an engine of social mobility. That's something I've shown in joint work with Antonin, Richard Blondel, and other co-authors. So competition, education, good labor market policy makes you both more inclusive and more innovative. So I think those are policies in general you should implement. Europe versus US is the Draghi report. What is the premise of the Draghi report? That way, why is US more innovative? They have the well-funded a basic research system, very well-funded university. They have the NSF, the National Science Foundation, the National Institute of Health, and they have private donors foundation like the Howard Hughes Medical Investigators that funds long-term researchers. We have nothing in France to finance long-term research, nothing. And they do have these kind of things in the US. So for basic research, they have a very good system. Then they have, when you want to go into startup, they have venture capital, very well developed. For innovation in larger firms, they have institutional investors, pension funds, mutual funds. We don't have anything like that. Neither the venture capital is underdeveloped in France and Europe, and institutional investors. So all the financial ecosystem, very much in Europe, is bank finance. That's what the Draghi report says. And the banks are not suited for frontier innovation. They don't take risk. Banks are very bureaucratic. You see what I mean? You need venture capital. You need people who take risk. They share control with you. They share profit with you, but they help you. They are like a parent. And then as you do better and better, they withdraw progressively control rights and revenue rights. Okay, that's very good. That's great with venture capital. We don't have anything of the like, and we don't have integrated capital markets. So that's very much the financial ecosystem in Europe is totally inadequate for frontier innovation. And another thing in Europe is that the single market is not single because, in fact, each country has its own regulation. And that's why Draghi calls for a much more unified product market. Okay? When you have a more unified product market, innovators have bigger rents for their innovation, and you have more competition, which is also good for innovation. And finally, so that's really they have in the US the DARPA, Defense Advanced Project Agency. You see, that's a modern way to do industrial policy. They were racing with the Soviet Union on space and defense in the 50s. They created the DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agencies. When money comes from the government, they have team leaders from industry or academia, and those elicit competing projects to fulfill a mission, put a man in space in 2 years, achieve, you see what I mean? And that's very suited. Then they created in the US the ARPA Energy, and more recently the BARDA, the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, thanks to which we are all here today. We are all here today because the RNA messenger technology, which was invented in Europe, in fact became mass production of vaccines based on RNA, ARN messager, thanks to the BARDA. BARDA did exactly what DARPA had done. You had to produce mass production of vaccines based on RNA within a year. And Moncef Slaoui, somebody who could tell you about that, is exactly the same way as DARPA. They had team leaders and competing projects, competing labs producing RNA messenger messenger vaccines. So we don't have anything like a DARPA in Europe. You see what I mean? Europe is a regulatory giant and a budgetary dwarf. And we don't have anything like the basic research like they have in the US. We don't have anything like the financial ecosystem. Our good and services market is still too divided, not sufficiently unified market and a single market. And finally, we don't have anything approaching the DARPA type of industrial policy as they have in the US. So we are well below the US on all these dimensions. And what Draghi recommends is that Europe should wake up and realize that, you have China. China is becoming very strong now on innovation. You have the US, and Europe needs to wake up. And that I think is a kind of a first order thing. If one good thing could come out of the American election is that Europeans should wake up, realize that they have to count on themselves, and that Europe is in threat of decay compared to US and China. For the moment, US is high, China is on the rise, Europe is falling. So something has to be done.
May God hear you. Thank you. So I wanted also to bounce on another idea that especially the young generation, is interested in. The idea that Robert mentioned, and which is, according to me, crucial, this idea of green investment. And you said that green investment could crowd out productive investment. So I wanted to be a bit provocative by telling you, do you believe in green growth?
We have 8.1 billion people in the world. The total population of the US and these 17 European countries is 800 million people. 90% of the people live outside of the rich countries. The future of climate change is going to depend on how fast and how much fossil fuel is used in the other 90% of the world's population. For me, I see that renewable energy is continually coming down in price. We'll get less crowding out, the lower is the price of renewable energy. So if we slow down a bit, if we postpone the date of zero emissions from 2050 to 2060 or 2070, it's not going to make any difference at all in overall increase in the temperature of the Earth. But it will reduce the crowding out. The need to scrap home heating, the need to completely eliminate the internal combustion engine factories in Germany that make all these cars. All I'm doing is suggesting that we slow down to reduce the crowding out. And certainly you can't deny the fact that there's going to be a lot of investment needed to make the green transition that's going to take resources away from other useful things.
I think,
Philippe,
yeah, just on the green transition, so I worked a bit, again, with Darren and Leo Burstein and David Emus on green growth through green innovation. So the view is that we need to operate the green transition. Of course, we need to plan the green transition. The main instruments for green transition are the carbon tax and industrial policy and green industrial policy. And so we have to manage, we have to induce more green innovation. Firms that innovated a lot in dirty technologies in the past, they tend to continue innovating in dirty technologies in the future. We call that path dependence. So if we have laissez-faire policy, we are in danger of environmental disaster. So we want to avoid that. We have to boost green innovation. And to boost green innovation, you need to redirect firms' innovation towards green technologies. You do that partly with the carbon tax and partly with green industrial policy. And so to push for, new, you want to build railroads much more. You want to, industrial policy is very important to help. For example, IRA is a green industrial policy, what they do in the US. So in Europe, they tend to do more carbon tax. In the US, they tend to do more the industrial policy. And what we argue in that paper and subsequent work is that you need both, because you have both an environmental externality and the path dependence knowledge externality. externality. When you have two externalities, you need at least two instruments. You need the industrial policy, and you need the carbon tax. If you don't have the carbon tax, you see, firms will never want to go to green. So even if the government puts money into, in industrial policy, tries to get co-financing by private sector, if the carbon price is too low, firms will not go into the green. So you need the carbon price, but you also need the green industrial policy. And I think we need to do that. We need to see at which pace we do it. But it's important not to give up on the green transition. We can make it less painful by having suitable government intervention and a good mix of instruments. We can reduce the cost on current generations by adding industrial policy to carbon tax policy. So, but I think the green. Of course, there is always a short-term cost. But the problem, that's I want to respond to Robert. If you delay the transition, then we know that it will be more painful tomorrow. It's really, I go back to my dentist. When you have a cavity and you wait to go to the dentist, the cavity gets deeper and more drilling is required. It's a bit the same with green growth. If we don't do anything now, we give an environmental debt to future generations. So we have to be very careful that we have the true debt, but we have the environmental debt, which means how much future generations will have to spend to themselves get us out of the climate problem, of the climate change problem, and we have to manage those. Voilà, that's so it's voilà. We have to we cannot put all the burden on current generations, but we cannot delay the transition too much, because otherwise you make the cost too high to future generations, and that's a kind of trade-off there.
Thank you. Maybe I'm coming back to one of the headwinds that Robert mentioned, especially public debt, because you know that in the French public debate, we're talking about the budget right now, and we're talking much about the amount of debt that we have accumulated. So I was wondering that, do you think that this issue of public debt will prevent us from future growth and from having a wave of productivity that we experienced in the past? So what's your idea on this?
There's a simple reason why the United States has grown more rapidly since 2019 than Europe, and that is because we have had unchecked deficits. I will show you tonight the deficit to GDP, deficit, not debt, deficit to GDP ratio was 13% in 2021. It's been 6% per year every year since then. So the government has been pouring money into the economy in a sort of old-fashioned Keynesian stimulus, and that's one big reason why the US has grown faster than Europe. Of course, the debt is a problem. It's going to grow steadily in the United States to 100%, 110%, 120%. It will become gradually harder and harder for the government to sell its government bonds. The long-term interest rate will gradually go up. So what we have is, at least until today, we had total paralysis in the US system. Now what we're going to get, since it's very likely that Trump will have control of both houses in Congress, we're going to get even bigger deficits, because they're going to cut taxes on the rich, and they're going to spend all sorts of money fulfilling his various wild promises for tax cuts for this and tax cuts for that. And so on our side of the Atlantic, we are facing even faster growth in debt to GDP. On the Europe side of the Atlantic, you have the EU rules about allowable deficits, which are causing fiscal retrenchment in the UK and France, what I've read about, and perhaps in other places. And you have to figure out how to do the fiscal retrenchment in a way that is least harmful to growth. Pretty obvious how you would do that, but I'm not going to elaborate.
Yeah, so I want to just complete what Robert has. So talking about Europe, for France, for example, we have a high level of debt. So it's a problem if it keeps growing, voilà. And if it keeps growing in times that are good times. I mean, that's really so we have to show what. One good thing we have in France, we have a very efficient tax service. The DGFIP is extremely efficient. That's why, even despite our high level of debt, we don't have a worse grade than we have des notations our ratings remain okay because we have a very efficient tax. If education and health was as efficient as the DGFIP, we would have the most efficient state in the world, okay? That's the only thing that really works well. So it's important now, I know that we discussed budget reduction in France. What's important for France is to show that we take steps to reduce the budget deficit away from 6%, getting closer to 4 or 5, hopefully 3 in the medium term. So it's important to do it in a way which does not discourage innovation. You see, so they're very important to be supply side. We don't, for example, cutting on education is a very bad idea. Cutting on research is a very bad idea. So you should try other things. I had my own ideas there. I know if I say anything I could say, you will be very angry with me, so I won't talk about my other ways of doing. But I think there are ways to reduce our current deficit without harming our growth potential. So it's very important to maintain and even improve our growth potential, because in the long run, our ability to repay our debt, our ability to be credible despite our high debt level, is to increase our employment rate and to increase our growth rate. If we do things today that discourage employment and discourage innovation and growth, we are shooting ourselves in the feet, because in the medium and long term, it will reduce our ability to repay our debt. That's what's important. So it's important, even if you say taxation, okay, there are some tax you can introduce, but make sure that the new taxes don't harm our growth potential. Because we know that trop d'impôts tue l'impôt. There is something called the Laffer curve. If you put too high tax, you end up discouraging supply. That's why, so you have to be very careful how to target the tax increase, where to put it, and make sure that you do not impair new employment and new growth. We see, because that's where our credibility will come in the long run. So that, I think, is so I've seen, over the past 2 weeks, many people, anybody came up with her or his own idea of how to reduce the budget deficit in France, and some ideas were totally crazy, some ideas were less crazy, but there was never systematic say, how do I make sure that I reduce current spending, but in order to increase my ability. You see, the Draghi view on that. Draghi is a very smart guy, and what he said in his NBER lecture last year was to say member states in Europe should show discipline in how to manage current spending, so that collectively Europe could increase its ability to borrow. You could have more EU borrowing, but because member states would show, that they are disciplined in their way to manage their public finance. And that's what we have to do. We have to show seriousness, but not cutting on growth investments, to manage seriousness on, recurrent source of deficits, so that we can collectively in Europe increase our ability to invest in growth. So I mentioned all the Draghi steps, the investment of Draghi. That will only work out if member states show that they are serious. For example, the retirement, the pension, it's important to delay retirement age in France. I mean, now how you do it, should you do it with a point system or with another system? But it's obvious with longer life expectancy, we need to work for longer. That's obvious. We need to work more. I mean, for example, when you have some municipal employees, civil servants, in some of them work only 25 hours a week. C'est scandaleux, quoi. You should not work less than 35 hours. Sorry, 35 hours, but not less, quoi. I believe, in the employment rate is much higher in Germany than it is in France. That's one of the main reasons why Germany has less of a deficit problem and a debt problem than we do. So it's important to do that, but it's important, whatever we do, not to cut our employment potential, creation potential, and our growth potential. That, I think, is very. Then there are various ways, to manage things, and we can do it in a way which is also where les sacrifices sont partagés. I believe that it has to be done in a way which is fair, which protects the most vulnerable, and where you ask everybody to contribute. And I think you can do that. I think you can be fair. in the way you operate. Voilà. You have to show fairness and sacrifice. And then I think people are more ready to, population, the citizens are more ready to accept sacrifices if they feel that the sacrifices are fairly shared. So I think that's the kind of thing and Draghi, that's what they did in Italy. They managed to reduce their public spending under Draghi and before Prodi, and they improve. That's how they could get a voice. You get a voice if you show a discipline.
You agree with Philippe?
I wanted to, yes, what he's saying, he knows much more about how to get fiscal reform in France than I do. But I just wanted to talk about the 35-hour week, because this man is so brilliant. You've heard about his co-authors. All it takes him to write another published article is 35 hours.
Maybe a last question, a bit polemic to finish with. You know that there are people who advocate that degrowth would be a good idea, yet some argue that it would increase inequalities. So do you think that maybe secular stagnation and degrowth would be a chance?
Repeat the question.
Yeah, I said, yeah, you know that some people are arguing that degrowth would be a good idea, that we should stop growing. So do you think that it could be a chance and secular stagnation or degrowth could be a chance?
That reminds me of the argument for free trade and the opposing argument for industrial policy. Do you care more about the welfare of the consumer who is benefited by cheap imports, or do you care more about the industrial worker who is hurt by cheap imports? The whole idea of going against growth is an idea of going against the improvement in the standard of living of the average family, which has been occurring in the industrial world for the last 250 years. So degrowth seems to me to be a non-starter of an idea. The people who are against growth are typically very green activists who think that growth is inherently incompatible with cooling the climate or stopping climate change. And we have our different ideas about that. I'm suggesting that we allow the enormous technical improvements in solar and wind energy to come down in price and make the green transition less painful.
Yeah, so I will totally concur with what Robert said. You know, how do you reduce emissions? One way is to say, I rely on innovation, because innovation can reduce, you can produce with less energy, or you can find cleaner energy, okay? So both of those will contribute to reduce emissions. But of course, there is the other way, is to say, well, you reduce GDP le PIB par habitant, and you reduce population. So those who are for degrowth, they say no, we ignore innovation, no way to improve on the source of energy, and no way to make production more energy effective. We rely on the reducing population or reducing production per head, ok? Ça, c'est la décroissance. Donc, c'est Malthus, quoi. C'est, you make less babies, ok? You do like China, you restrict the one-child policy, or you decide to do what we did in France between March and May, June 2020, when we had no vaccine. We went through degrowth, but we were forced to do degrowth. We had an experience of degrowth in France. France GDP went down by 35% between March and May, June 2020, and CO2 emissions went down by 8%. So we know what degrowth is. Would you like to be permanently in the first lockdown, le premier confinement? We know it had also dramatic effects on the youth, on developing countries. We know the thing. But so I am, of course, for innovation. Innovation to make production less energy intensive, and innovation to also look for new sources, cleaner sources of energy, okay? But this said, not everything that the degrowth people say is stupid. They tell you have to be more sober. You have to be more careful. Don't take transatlantic flights every day, quoi. Do that twice a year, once a year. That is okay. They take good habits, you know what I mean? I think that is a good thing from them. And they also say, go from quantity to quality. And I mentioned that before. One thing which is very interesting is that as as people become wealthier, economies become wealthier, they tend to go more for quality. For example, when you go to a good restaurant, it's the same quantity of meat, but a lot of it is services. So what's very interesting is that as we are developing, we tend to go more from quantity growth to quality growth. Quality growth has two nice things. Quality growth is service intensive, which is less polluting, and it's less well measured by GDP growth. So that's what's very interesting. In fact, we go increasingly into something that affects what you call consumer surplus, and which is less polluting because it relies a lot on services. So from the degrowth, I take the idea that we should move forward quality, but that's exactly what development does for you. More developed countries tend to go towards quality more and towards more service intensive, less polluting per unit of consumption. And that, I think, is a kind of interesting development. So I believe in the possibility that, I reconcile with the degrowth the fact that we go from quantity to quality, but what I don't take from them is that we should ignore innovation. In fact, increasingly, innovation will follow what consumers want, and what consumers want is quality. So increasingly, innovation will go towards improving quality. And that, I think, is a source of hope, in the sense. We will go increasingly towards innovation that improves quality of life, and that makes us pollute less per unit of consumption.
Robert, maybe a last word?
I think this is a wonderful discussion. I think you should go home with some thoughts about how to make Europe a better place. You're very young. You have the whole 21st century ahead of you. And what you want to do is figure out how to get Europe to be as pleasant a place as it is. 5 of the happiest countries in the world are in Europe. And none of them are in the United States. So be happy where you live and work to make European institutions and governments more unified, more of a single market, more of a single government. And also, I would highly recommend adopting one language, and you know which one I'm recommending.
Thank you very much to our 2 speakers.